Bollywood State of Mind, a journey into the world's biggest cinema. It's been described as a gem of a book and a must for film lovers everywhere. And the Telegraph said, prepare to laugh, sob and dance. This lively history of Indian cinema is imprinted with the memories of a lifelong cinephile. The author of A Bollywood State of Mind is Singh, and she joins us live on the line now. Good morning to you, Sunny.
Good morning, right back.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, for those of us who don't know the history, the colour, the passion, the emotion, the music, the drama, and sometimes the downright silliness of Bollywood, should we do a crash course in Bollywood, please?
Ooh, crash course in Bollywood. Let's try. I think perhaps the best way to start is Bollywood or Bombay cinema or commercials, Hindi cinema, however you want to call it. Cinema that's made in Bombay is one of about 18 different cinemas made in India. So my book covers, first of all, till the talkies, the history of Indian cinema, and then hones in from 1930 onwards to Hindi cinema or Bombay cinema, which we often know as Bollywood. And that's a very long tradition. That dates back to about 110 years of history.
Right.
Because, we are, in India, we are a country, a nation of movie fanatics. And I think the best way to explain that is cinema arrived in India 6 months after the technology was introduced in Paris and was an immediate success. So we have been making cinema since 1896. Of course, the early ones were very short, but the first feature film is 1912. So that's a long time of making movies, and a lot of movies.
Yeah.
We make a lot of movies.
And so those early films, who were they? I mean, you'd say you'd have a focus group now, wouldn't you? But who was the target audience then? Who were they aiming at? Was it amongst sort of the intelligentsia of society at the time?
Well, no, that's the interesting part. The very first feature film in India is made. It's a silent film. It's made by a man by the name of Dadasaheb Phalke. Phalke is a photographer, does not know anything, like most people at that time, about cinema at all. But he goes in to see a French film, The Life of Jesus Christ. Again, a silent film. And comes out and says, we need to put our movies up. We need to put our stories up on screen. At the same time, there's a developing understanding that cinema could possibly be really important, because at this point, this is colonial era, the literacy levels in India, or actually wider South Asia, are in very low single digits. So you can't really send out pamphlets when people can't read. How do you get through to them? And cinema becomes that particular vehicle. So the first film is called Raja Harishchandra. It's an adaptation of a very, very popular play about a righteous king. And already there's certain themes, ideas, tropes are built in, including things like the cruelty, not just of fate, but of the regime. The lack of justice, and then, of course, there's going to be a king. In Raja Harishchandra, it's a king who's saved by a deity, but very quickly after that, it becomes very much an exercise in the sort of religiously cloaked cinema, and then the very clearly social and political cinema. And that's really an interesting way of thinking about it, because this is not aimed at the elite. This is cinema made for the people. And it's made in many ways by the people. So yes, you have elite, Himanshu Ray, Devika Rani, that kind of producers who go to RADA and they then go study and train in Berlin, and they go back and set up a studio where they have German technicians before the Second World War. But bulk of this cinema is being made by people who are not necessarily from really upper class backgrounds. It's also extremely inclusive, regionally, religiously, ethnically, however you want to call it. So in some ways, I think Bombay cinema, more than all other cinemas in India, really exemplifies a kind of idea of India.
How are these movies in the early days, or should we say up until, let's say, the 50s or 60s, how were they how are they distributed and where are they shown?
Well,
I mean, it's India. It's not like the UK. It's vast.
Yeah, it's vast. It is vast, but it's really interesting. So the first film that Falke makes, he actually has one reel that he gets processed and set up for exhibition. But it's done in Bombay. It's already kind of, there are these theaters which are primarily doing American cinema that are, and French cinema, obviously, imported films rather, it's silent films. But he takes out the cinema, starts to exhibit it, and then that becomes a huge success. So then they have to make further reels, which is quite funny. But then it becomes very quickly a process of using all the cinemas that exist for this material. It's also, of course, as time goes by, films are shown everywhere. I mean, I remember seeing movies because my father was at that point in the army. It would be a play, a parade ground for the army in the cantonment, and there'd be a massive, 3-ton truck, which we call Shaktimans at APC. And they would put a sheet on the back of it, and we'd all sit around, and the adults had chairs. We just had like these rugs that were spread on the ground, and we sat and watched the movies. And that's actually very similar to the ways films would have been watched before. So they were outdoor, they were, yes, there were movie theaters which come up, and this beautiful, area of gorgeous modern architecture in India, which is the movie theater architecture, which are just stunning. So, yeah, but that would be more or less how it would work.
And we're talking about getting a message over to a population who are, I mean, obviously literary levels in India have improved somewhat since those early days. But rather than I suppose that one of the great crafts of Bollywood is getting a message across to people, but at the same time, not doing, if you think about 50s England, it was all angry young men and kitchen sink dramas and Kathy Come Home and all those really hard-hitting social. Now, if you did that in an Indian rural audience, you'd lose. They'd be like, well, hey, you think you've got a hard time? You should see what I'm dealing with in the field. So they segue these between the beautiful costumes, the great colours, the action sequences, and of course the music. Is that a fair comment? Am I way wide on this, Sunny?
Well, I think you're working off some idea of cinema, which is an Indian cinema, which is fair. But I think what we have to think that it's a completely different kind of cinema, right, in terms of its form, in terms of the way the story is told, the way things, the way it's structured. So, for example, already back in the 20s, they were making films, silent films, about things like sexually transmitted diseases and the impact on a marriage and home. I mean, this is hard-hitting stuff. There were films being made about caste. There were films being made about discrimination and women's rights. So I think the difference is that unlike most of, let's say, British or European cinema, we don't necessarily think that you have to be grim in order to address a serious subject. You can address really complex things in a way that is still beautiful, that is still connects to people. There is still music, and music doesn't have to be all cheery. There's an enormous corpus of film music in India, which ranges from peppy dance number to some really philosophical, complex work. And much of this was written and has been written by some of the greatest poets in the country of the last 100 years. So I think it's a different way of thinking about it, where they didn't have to hide the message. They just constructed it completely, and they still do as part of the way a film is structured.
And during the struggle for independence and 48 and India becomes independent, I mean, how does the film industry tackle that subject and the finally getting free from the British?
Well, 1947 is when in India, South Asia becomes independent. But already, as I said, from early days, the messages about the freedom struggle are embedded. There is a constant cat and mouse game between cinema, filmmakers, and the imperial government, to the point that the British Raj brings in censorship laws very quickly after the industry kicks off. So you're thinking 1915, 1916. almost overnight. It's like, oh no, they've lost movies, bring in the censorship. And they're very good at this cat and mouse game, where they embed. Often they will embed documentary reels of major leaders speaking. There are films that make direct reference, for example, to Gandhi. There are songs that include anti-British, anti-imperial lyrics. And there's a constant process because the British keep trying to stop it. And so they put it in and then it's censored, or they cut it out like, oh, look, it's gone. Or in one of my favorite cases, they actually include, it's 1940s, the Second World War is on. And there's a super popular song, part of a movie that says, Dur hato o dunya walo Hindustan, hamara hai, get away the world, Hindustan or India is ours. And of course the censors are kind of like, yeah, well, we kind of know who you're talking about. So the lyricists come do something really clever. They add in a little line somewhere at the bottom of the song that says Germans and Japanese. And then they say, look, we're talking about the Axis. We're not actually talking about the British. So this is a constant process. And I think in 47, something really exciting happens because India becomes independent and the movie industry shifts. It stops, well, it still looks back towards the freedom struggle, but it then becomes about constructing and imagining and narrating a modern India. What does this free India look like? What does this state that's being built look like and society is going to look like? And a lot of that material continues. But what I find really interesting is that there's a cynicism and there's a skepticism even at that point. So that's actually where the Indian noir is born very quickly in 1951. That's where Raj Kapoor is already kind of going, this is really bad. This is not the dream we planned. There is a hope that we can get there, but it's not a kind of wide-eyed, optimistic way of thinking about it. And I think it's because these filmmakers and actors and, they're part of a political struggle for so long that they're not willing to just kind of say, well, yes, it's all done and dusted. They're very committed to then kind of thinking where it goes next.
And as opposed to, and again, I may be completely wrong because, hey, it's me, but as opposed to other film industries, perhaps like the States, they make the films and then they market them to the outside world. And most of the British film industry does the same if there is even one. Is it fair to say that up to a certain point, so maybe 20, 30 years ago, that Bollywood or the Indian film industry was really pushing for a domestic market, or were they looking for an international market even then? Because obviously, when you look at the top 10 listings, you will see, especially in the UK now, films coming out of India coming in at number 3, coming in at number.
Yeah. And I mean, that's in box office terms, it's very much shifted in lots of places. But I think there's a couple of things. For much of the film industry's history since 1947, they were working against huge financial constraints. There were, and also geopolitical constraints. This is the Cold War. There's the quote unquote free world. There's the Soviet Union. And then there is this wonderfully strange grouping of the non-aligned countries, which are basically formerly colonized countries. So it's interesting to think about, yes, a huge market was India. The first target is always India. The audience is always Indian for not just Bombay cinema, but right across. But Indian cinema was traveling, and it travels all over Asia, Africa. I'm always fascinated where I find people who love the cinema, and they have memories not just of now, not 20, 30 years ago, of the 50s. And one of the things that happens with Greece is that in the 60s, when they decide that they're going to be European, one of the things they ban. And the cultural ministry is very clear that they're sick and tired of Indian cinema, which is hugely popular amongst the working classes, but they feel that is too Eastern and backward, and also possibly critical of the state. But so things like, Mother India were huge. And that's the one thing they stop, because they now they decide they're going to be properly European. And then, so that's when they start, stop this kind of cinema and then expand it elsewhere. Curiously enough, Turkey has a similar process because it's huge, and the regime is like, this is not a good way forward. We need to get away with it. But I think the difference is in the last 30 years, Indian cinema has the financial wherewithal, if you want to call it that way, to start competing in markets that are originally dominated or have been historically dominated by Hollywood or their own national cinemas. Having said that, already in 2006, National Geographic had a statistic which said that Indian Bollywood, if you want to call it that shorthand, reaches over 1 billion more people across the world than Hollywood does. Now, I admit that 1 billion people are Indian, but that also means internationally the two cinemas were reaching the same numbers.
Sure.
And I think that's...
And with the advent of streaming as well, I mean, that has cut down distribution, and it's meant you can pump more. It's direct into your home wherever you may be, wherever your community may be.
Yeah, and you can see that it's also really interesting because it's a lot of smaller films that could not have afforded to be, screen spaces in London and New York. Now they're accessible. There's also material around collaboration. So one of the things that happens, for example, with Shah Rukh Khan, who's one of the major actors and one of the possibly biggest stars of the world, pretty much for the last few years, the title song is always recorded and released for all his movies. At least one song is recorded and released in West Asia and Northern Africa in Arabic.
Right.
And I think that says something about where it reaches and who it reaches.
And the flip side is, I mean, a couple of my friends are actors, and they are now getting work, and the European actors, and they're getting work in India. Admittedly, they're playing British baddie number one, in these colonial things, but they're happy because they're working actors, and they say, Giles, we go and shoot, and the facilities are amazing, and the reception is incredible, and it's a really rather nice way of doing it rather than, being third spear carrier on the Game of Thrones reboot.
Oh, yes, definitely. No, I think, but also it's worth noting that this has existed for a very long time. There was this immense amount of collaboration with, obviously, the German film industry until the war breaks out in 1939. And Britain, India is a colony, so Britain implements these anti-foreign laws. So everybody's either expelled or incarcerated. But even back in the 20s and early 30s, they were making films. India was making films in Italy, for example. There's an extraordinary film, which is a silent film made in Italy, in Rome, shot in Rome with Italian actors. It was, of course, one of the joys of silent cinema was you could cast people from anywhere because you didn't have to worry about them speaking. And then, of course, talkies arrive, and then it's a little bit more complicated. Sure. But yeah, unfortunately, that does mean that unless your friends learn Hindi, they are going to be stuck playing the baddies. Well, hey, I think as long as they get paid, I don't think they really were too worried. Who should we be looking at then at the moment in the current crop of Indian filmmakers and producers? Oh, I'm sorry to throw that one at you, saying it's sunny, but. Oh, well, it's quite strange because the biggest star still is a man who's dominated cinema for over 30 years, and that's Shah Rukh Khan. And he's just had 2 releases back to back this year. They've been huge, massive, immense successes. He's in his late 50s, and he's reinvented himself as an action star, which is not his normal image. So it was quite weird. But he's done huge business worldwide. And I think Pathan and Jawan, which is the most recent one, are really incredible. He's got another film coming out. There are a series of younger actors and actresses who are doing really interesting stuff. Alia Bhatt, Ranveer Singh. And then there is this really interesting process because I think Aditya Chopra's studios, YRF, have created a really interesting model of kind of supporting young experimental filmmakers and kind of mentoring them. So a lot of times, if you go onto Netflix, wherever you are in Europe, you can grab Netflix and you will find some of the greatest, most interesting releases coming out of the industry. Also, one last thing, there's some great stuff not only that features women, but what's been really brilliant with streaming is there's a lot of older major stars, women stars, who now have this incredible second innings of doing really meaty, solid, fabulous roles. And it's through streaming.
How do you boil it all down into one book, though, Sunny? That's the question.
I had to cut a lot out. This book could have been a lot longer. So I had a good editor who was like, okay, let's cut it back. But it was hard. It was hard. I think there's just at least another few books to be written. I hope that the book starts a conversation, which means other people will be doing doing other stuff with it.
So if the listener's sitting out there thinking, okay, this sounds intriguing. I mean, two things. One, go out and buy the book. You'll be able to download it from our own virtual bookstore. But two, what should they, if they want to dip their toes into the ocean that is Indian cinema, just give me two or three that perhaps would be.
Okay. So this is a really interesting one. First, I think just because it's more modern, it's 2008, I would say Om Shanti Om. Mm-hmm. Because it's very classically, it's big budget, glitzy Bollywood, but it's also got lots of stuff. It's also a cinephiles movie because every frame references a whole history of cinema. If you want a more classic, I would go to Sholay. That's 1975. Yeah. It's what's often been dubbed the curry western because It's inspired by Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns.
Shot in Almeria, which is literally 3 hours up the road from where I am at the moment.
Yeah, sadly shot in South India, but still pretty close. Okay. You'd be surprised. I think a lot of people would be like, "Hey, that looks like Almeria." So I would say Sholay. If you're going to, do modern, I would say 2013. Look up Jawan. Which is quite political, quite an action film, lots of drama, but good songs. And if you want a little family thing, look up Rocky and Rani, which is a lovely little love story, which is kind of fun, but has lots of issues around gender and sexuality and the family and so on. So lots of good stuff out there.
Fabulous. The book is called A Bollywood State of Mind. It's by Sunny Singh, who we're speaking to today. Sunny, if people want to find you online, do you do the socials? Are you online? Where can we find you?
I am all over the socials. If there is a social channel, I exist on it. My handle is always the same. It's Prof, P-R-O-F, Sunny Singh. For my sins, I am an academic, although this book is not an academic book, hence the Prof. But you can find me on Insta, Twitter, or X, as they call it, TikTok, you name it. It's there. Blue Sky. There.
Look forward to it. You'll be able to download the book as well from our own virtual bookstore. The book is called A Bollywood State of Mind, A Journey to the World's Biggest Cinema. It is by Prof. Sunny Singh. Sunny, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you today.
Thank you for having me.